Okay, so my point with the Bible stuff is that depending on one way of looking at religion it is. I mean, this is a silly thing to say, but it's a interesting parallel. Is you may think about people of religion being essentially fans of a book, right? So one of the things a religion is, it's essentially a fan group for a book. And the thing is that those fan groups will reject certain parts of the story, right? They go, well, like, so for example, Jewish people feel like what's often called the Old Testament, that's the Bible. And what essentially, one way to think about Judaism is there are people who say the sequel, that's nonsense. I don't take the sequel seriously. Because what is the New Testament but a sequel to the Torah, which is then gets, they change the name from the Torah to the Old Testament. Um, right, but it's people who reject the sequel. This is a little, you may think about famous movies, that a series that like used to be good and then got kind of bad, and people will be like, you just watch the first two and then after that they're all trash. Mackenzie, what's an example of that?
Um, TV shows, a lot of the
Oh
time, the
yeah.
first few like seasons of something are really good, and then it's not
Right.
anymore.
That's excellent example, right? So there are TV shows that are really good for a couple of seasons, and then it's like, yeah, just skip the rest. It's trash. So
Yeah.
Dexter, for example, was total garbage, and the last season of Dexter was one of the worst. True Blood was one of the worst ending seasons I've ever seen. And so if you were recommending it to somebody, you'd be like, dude, just watch the first season or whatever. Don't keep going. That's essentially what Jewish people are doing. They're saying like the real essence, the story, that what really matters is the so-called Old Testament, right, the Torah, and they're rejecting the sequel. Um, but this gets very complicated very fast, because for the Catholics and Protestants, the Bibles are almost it's the same, except there are some parts of the Bible that Catholics think shouldn't be in the Bible, and so they take it out. There's stuff they think should be in there that the Protestants don't, and they put it in. Um, and so the relationship between these religions has a lot to do with what they consider to be official. It's canon is the word. If it's canonical, then it's part of the official Bible. You don't think about it, but somebody decides. There's a million ancient books, and a Bible literally means collection of books, Book of Genesis, Book of Exodus. And so somebody is picking the books that matter and putting them together and giving them to you, saying, "Here's our religion." Um, Somebody's picking them and putting them together, and different religions are picking that differently, so that the Jewish people are not including all of this Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're like, no, that's not part of the official Bible. But the Christians are like, are you kidding? That's the most important part, and they'll give you that one separately. Um, so one way to think about it is fans are determining what counts as official or not. Um, that 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 Shakespeare, and that just the way editors will be like, I don't think, I literally, editors will be like, this speech is very bad. I don't think Shakespeare wrote it. I'm cutting it out of the play. That 100% has happened. And so like there's whole chunks of Hamlet that people are like, no, that doesn't count. So actually, that's less true of Hamlet, but it's true of other plays where people have argued that certain sections of them don't belong or aren't official. All right, I want to jump back into the Foucault text and kind of keep looking at this thing. So let's go to paragraph 2 here. Second, the author function is not universal or constant in all discourse. Right? It's not the same in all civilizations. Even within our civilization, the same types of texts have not always required authors. Um, there was a time when those texts, which we now call literary, stories, folk tales, epics, tragedies, were accepted, circulated, and valorized without any question about the identity of the author. Their anonymity was ignored because their real or supposed age was a sufficient degree of their authenticity. So for a long time, people didn't give a shit about authors at all. They were just like, it's old, it must be good. Well, who wrote it? Don't know. Beowulf, for example. If you've ever heard of Beowulf, no one has any clue who wrote that book. There's no author on it at all. It's a book. Some monk wrote it. Don't know that guy's name. Nobody knows that guy's name. It's just written anonymously. Didn't sign it. Beowulf's complicated. I taught Beowulf for years, and now I'm sick of it. So he, all right. So that's right. Texts, however, that we now call scientific, dealing with cosmology and the heavens, medicine or illness, natural sciences, geography, were only considered truthful during the Middle Ages if the name of the author was indicated. Statements on the order of Hippocrates said, or Pliny tells us that, were not merely formulas for argument based on authority, they marked a proven discourse. So sometimes people would only accept something if it had an author, and it had to have a particular author's name. This is hard to believe, but people took, we did Plato in this class. For a long time, people took Plato so seriously that if Plato said something and their eyeballs saw something else, they'd be like, Plato's got to have it right. There's no way he got this wrong. So Aristotle, for example, Aristotle was a student of Plato's who had theories about biology and reproduction and how babies are born, and people just insisted he was correct. They were just like, but Aristotle said it. Aristotle can't be wrong. And it took a long time for people to be like, no, there are not little tiny babies in the heads of sperm that go into the woman's body and she cooks them like an oven. It's literally what people thought. So people had to, the scientific establishment had to fight against people who thought that just because someone famous said it, it must be real. Let's see, I'm going to finish this paragraph. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a totally new conception was developed when scientific texts were accepted on their own merits and positioned within an anonymous and coherent conceptual system of established truths and method of verification. So the whole point of science is you're supposed to be able to repeat it. So it kind of doesn't matter who published the scientific article. It's not true because this important guy said it. It's true because I can reproduce the results in a laboratory. Doesn't matter who said it. Okay, cool. So the authentication no longer required reference to an individual who had produced them. The role of the author disappeared as an index of truthfulness, and where it remained as an inventor's name, it was merely to denote a specific theorem or proposition, a strange effect, a property, a group of elements. So scientists will give their names to stuff, but it's not true because the scientist said it's true. It's true because you can reproduce it in a lab. Okay, so the point is that and this is one of the biggest points in the class that I'll make all semester long, and Mackenzie will let me know if I've made it before. This is the hardest part about teaching online, is that I repeat myself a lot because I have 4 classes, and without anybody here, there's nobody here to be like, oh yeah, you told us this already. Because maybe I told it to my other class. I have no idea, no way to tell. The fuck was I going to talk about? Oh, all the things you think of as true, like universally true, are really just local. They're local in time and they're local in space. So that you're like, oh, I know what an author is, but people thought differently about authors 100 years ago. People thought differently about authors 500 years ago. People thought differently about authors 1,000 years ago. People think about authors differently in the sciences than they do in religion, than they do in history books. Scientists don't really care about authors. They just care about whether the things the person said are true. Whereas religious people, it's very important. The difference, did Jesus say it or not, is a pretty big deal. Because if Jesus said it, then it's coming from the mouth of God. And so you really want to figure out those things that Jesus actually said. Okay, cool. So the issue I want to put in this, just to say here, is that in all of this confusion, where I can't tell where an author begins and ends, and I can't tell where a book begins and ends, because there's so many people working to make a story happen, and because books can always be added to later. You found something, or someone's still alive and they make a sequel or a prequel. Because of that, one of the ways that we figure out what counts and doesn't count as like the official story is the fans. When chaos like that enters, it's the readers who decide what counts and doesn't count, and that's a really unusual. It's an unusual way of thinking about it, but it's worth thinking about fans and fan communities as co-creators in the story. And I think it's really important to have the religious example of people who like this book thousands of years later decide what parts of it are true and what parts of it are garbage. Each religion makes those calls. The Mormons are literally like, guys, there's a sequel. And everybody's like, no, Jesus did not go to America. That's not a thing. And the Mormons are like, yes, it is. This is the official book. But they're the only group that thinks Jesus visited America. All right, I'm picking this up in the next video.